February 2019 meeting of the Space Association. Thanks everyone for coming out. It's hot outside, so it's nice and cool in here, so that's good. We've got a big night tonight for you, so I'm glad you could make it, and we're going to get straight into it. So I don't know whether people know what this is, what this represents, but our friend Opportunity, we're going to get an update on this later, but Opportunity, she is no longer. So she served well long beyond her 90-day warranty, so I think we could all be pretty proud of that. So tonight we have, we're going to start off with just a bit of information about what's happening with the association and events around Melbourne and the area. And then we're going to have our quick presentation on our Look Back series on Apollo, which is 50 years ago in the lead up to Apollo 11. Then we're going to have our feature presentation called The Race to the Moon with Mark Hillyer. Unfortunately, Igor has been called back to Moscow for instructions, so he can't make it tonight. And then we're going to have a little break, and then we're going to get a second part, which is our news with, remember activities, Shane Usher, who's going to be here very shortly. He has been to Russia getting instructions again, and he's going to give us an update on what he's doing in relation to that. And then we're going to have our Space News Part 1, which is the industry update, and then Planetary Insights update, and by that time we'll all be completely exhausted and full of information. So we'll get straight into it. This is not happening here in Melbourne, it's happening up in Queensland, but one of our members is participating in this space event on the 16th of March. So I haven't got a whole lot of details about it, but it's this aviation high school. They focus on aviation and aerospace. So we've got a couple of members up there who are going to be putting together some presentations. Don't know a whole lot about it. We'll probably send more information out about it when we get more information. Big thing happening this week. In fact, the first day of it was today, was the Australian Space Industry Conference. Myself and Andrew Rennie, who is not here just yet, were out there. I think there was like 400 delegates. The place was packed. Everyone was talking about space. There were people from the Australian Space Agency. There were people from various industry, big industry, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, plus smaller startups and other medium-sized companies there, all talking about space in Australia and how it relates to the world. So really exciting, fantastic. I was really blown away because what happened was that some of the companies really shared with what they're doing already, and it's an amazing amount of business they're already doing it, but already all in sort of like a silo. So it's really fascinating. So that's on today. There's another half-day session tomorrow, which I'm not going to be able to get to, but if you happen to be at the Airshow, I don't know whether you have to pay to get into this part, but they've got these events happening for the morning. Then they go outside and watch the air display. Tim Parsons was here today. He spoke with our group before. He's a bit of an evangelist on New Space, so he was there. Come in, welcome. There's plenty of seats up here. You can get in the mosh pit. We'll be dancing on the tables later, so enjoy. And the bouncers will be keeping an eye on everyone, of course. And then we've got the second half tomorrow afternoon, which is a panel discussion, which I'd love to be at, which is going to be launch innovations, and so going to have representatives from different space groups, including different launch facilities providers. So Australian Space Launch, Equatorial Launch, which is up in Northern Territory, Southern Launch, which is in South Australia, Adam Gilmore from Gilmore Space, and so if you can get out there tomorrow and go and catch any of those presentations, I'd strongly urge that for you. Something else happening at the end of this week on Saturday, and I'll get Thomas to come up and talk about that, which is the Moon Forum on the Public Forum on the Moon. So I'll get Thomas, who's been the organiser of that, to give you a quick overview of what that is.
So they pay for transport.
Who's that?
To get to the moon. On the moon.
Well, you have to find out from Thomas. He'll give you all the details, and he's taking deposits later on tonight, I believe, just in the back pocket. Just give you a note, there's the introductory slide, and there's two slides which have got basically listed this week, the next two slides, and you can progress that forward and back there. There we go. And if you want to stand here, it'll catch on our stream mic as well.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Peter. Yeah, my name is Thomas Gooch from Office of Other Spaces. We're a landscape-focused organisation. We fuse frequent satellite remote sensing with a landscape architecture perspective. So we're kind of making a point that we can build cities within the environment, but our passion for nature extends to all landscapes. So we became the Moon Village Association Australian Regional Coordinator in 2017. And in that role, we're running this event on Saturday, which is at Federation Square, Deakin Edge. It's quite exciting. We've got the Australian Space Agency speaking, Victorian Government scientists, the Office of Victorian Government Architects. We're flying over ice space from Luxembourg to speak about mining and robotics. And the idea is that there's 4 sessions, mining, environments, medical, space industry, and we've got a moderator and 4 speakers on each panel. Each speaker will give a 10-minute presentation, so after 40 minutes we'll open it up to the floor to ask questions. So even though, you know, and I've learnt a lot from you guys and in the industry, there's a lot of people that don't know what's going on, and this gives a space to ask questions, have a dialogue between space and non-space actors. So yeah, we hope you can come along, hopes of value to create a space like this. We've got a landscape focus, so you know that pervades everything, but how do we go to the moon to help Earth? You know, that's a question to perhaps ask. So yeah, kicking off 10 a.m. Saturday till 6 p.m. There's 4 sessions. You can get a half-day ticket in the morning or the afternoon. You guys actually have a stand, which is fantastic. So I'm really pleased about that, people being able to come out of the sessions and talk to yourselves, and hopefully that's of value to you as well. So, yeah.
One more slide, next to the afternoon session.
Afternoon. So we've got World Space Week there as well. They've signed an MOU with the Moon Village Association, so there's quite a strong relationship there. They're speaking, so I think it'll be a very positive day. So any questions at all? No? Thank you very much. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, so if you just go search the website, you'll find links to book on. Is it Eventbrite or something that's handling tickets? Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for that, Thomas. Okay, so as we all know, it's the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 this year, and I kind of talked about it last week, so I'm not going to reiterate too much. We're still working on things. We're getting much closer. We're getting some really good stuff happening, so watch this space. Michael Abdullah over here is all over that, and we've got a few other things. We're working with, we're engaging with SBS to try and get them to play the entire moonwalk in real time on kind of a slow TV type concept. So there's a few people have come up with that concept, and we're pushing on SBS, so we'll see how we go with that. We'll let you know what's happening. I've been doodling, as is my want. I sort of come up with this concept of a commemorative logo, and just want to gauge people's thoughts about what they might think about that as far as a t-shirt or a coffee cup or something like that. What we're trying to depict here is the strong partnership between Australia and America on that project, because this is actually the dish at Tidbinbilla which carried the live TV signal from the moon for the first part of the moonwalk. That dish has actually moved from Honeysuckle Creek down to Tidbinbilla and is now deactivated, but that's the actual dish, and of course that's the moon landing spacecraft. Anyway, that's just a bit of fun on my part. Once again, I did mention last month, in Canberra, it's quite a big event up there, so they're taking bookings through this website. They've got a big 4-day event, I think, including a main sort of event on the actual Sunday, which is the day of the moon landing 50 years ago to the exact hour and minute. So there'll be a lot of people there from the space tracking community, which there are few and few of each year, of course. But there's a bunch of them up there that it's funny though, a few of us went up to the 40th in 2009, and they all said, this is our biggest and our last, we're all getting too damn old. Yeah, they've all gotten back on the horse now, they're doing the 50th, so yeah, it should be quite fun. A few of our members are going up. There's seats up here if you like, down here.
Peter, I think it's the aliens that you like. Marx has got something on that. Part of that or not?
I don't believe it's part of what they're doing. but and I'm not certain what parks are doing actually. That's a good question. I might try and dig up that and have some information for that next month. They're trying to expand out because there's been a bit of disgruntled because they say that, look, Tidmanbilla gets all the attention because, you know, there's a lot of people that are enthusiastically presenting about it. But, sorry, did I say Tidmanbilla? Honeysuckle Creek. But Tidmanbilla played an important part as well. So they're trying to pull that in as part of it as well. So watch this space. So just to reiterate our meetings, you obviously managed to work out when we have our meeting this month. Congratulations. But our formula, in case you do forget going forward, it is the fourth Monday of the month, apart from December, which we're going to be in at this stage, the 15th of December. And of course, as we always do every month, we are a member-based organisation. Memberships fund what we do, the meetings, the radio station, the live streaming, the special events. So if you are not a member and you'd like to be, please see Tim over here with a white shirt and no hair. Or if you are a lapsed member, come back to us. And if you can bring an extra person along, that'd be great as well. So just to end on a bit of a sad note on this particular segment, people may or may not be familiar with the name Kate Doolan. Kate was at various times a member of our association, and she actually was an author along with a whole bunch of other things. She actually co-authored a book called Fallen Astronauts with Colin Burgess, which talked about primarily about the Apollo 1 fire and the other astronauts that died in the US program anyway, relating to the striving for the moon. So unfortunately she had sort of fallen into ill health in the last few years and lost contact with many of us. And we sadly got the news late last month that she did in fact pass away. So this is Kate, in case you're not familiar with her, with her famous cat. And Kate held some various meetings and presentations for our group. This is her back in 2012 doing a presentation. Always one for a chat and a bit of a joke, and quite a lively person, and sadly missed. This is a picture I dug up off of our radio station website back in 1994, when we were all much younger, thinner, and had more hair. So this is with John Young and Mark Hillyer over here interviewing John Young. Sad times. And Thomas, bit of an underachiever, but anyway. And I don't know what this came from, but Kate was involved in this Camilla Coronis SBO, this rubber chicken that basically got a whole lot of notoriety and was taken around in balloons and all that. And Kate was dragging that around Australia at one stage up to Port Douglas. So always one for a laugh out, Kate. So so this was the last post that Kate made on Twitter. End of January, start of February was always an important time for Kate because of, you know, the connection with the passing of, well, particularly a lot of US astronauts, and so I think that says a lot. That was her last tweet. So so with that, I'll just get you to raise your glass and give a toast to Kate Doolan. To Kate. Alright, so now we're going to continue on. Thanks, Thomas. Take care. We're going to continue on. Is this, what's happening here? Is the other presentation loaded? Do you know?
Just toggle through.
Didn't load it.
It's just on the desktop.
do I get to the desktop? Where would we be without OT issues?
Apollo 11 countdown, 5:25.
That's it. Perfect.
And
Thank you, sir.
that button, and then wait for me to give you a thumbs up.
Copy that. Now, just to let everyone know, we have a live stream audience that it goes out to, so I have to wait for my producer to give me the thumbs up because we've got ratings to deal with, and you know our multi-million dollar sponsors demand their, well, not quite. Oh, good. All right. So yeah, this is called Apollo 11 plus 50, and for those who are not familiar with it, I'll take you through a quick overview of it. We're just calling it the Footsteps to the Moon, the countdown to Apollo 11, which happened once again 50 years ago this year. So basically, we're providing a monthly progress report in sort of semi-real time plus 50 years, just to give you an idea of all the stuff that was going on back then, which is quite fun. And we'll culminate in the July meeting talking about Apollo 11. So we're going to have also a couple of feature episodes, one of which is tonight. The other ones will be on the Australian effort and contribution to the mission and the whole program, which was quite significant, and also the decision along the lunar orbit rendezvous Apollo mission mode selection, how they worked out what type of mission they were going to fly and what vehicles, down the funny if you want, what they were going to do, because it's quite a significant turning point in the whole architecture of the program, and amazing how quickly they made the decisions. Anyway, and once again we look at the USSR and versus the Soviet Union. But first, we've got to do our time travel. It's tradition. So this is modern television in 2019. I'm sure you're all glued to it every week or day or whatever it is. I'm certainly not. And we've got to do our time machine now. We'll just have to go back in time for a minute. There we go. There we go. It's on back now. Hold on to your seats. All right. So now we're back in 1969 TV, the good old days. Anyone remember Graham Kennedy? You remember Graham? Ah, yes. That was the good old days in Melbourne tonight. All right. So now we're all back in 1969. How do you feel? You're looking much more attractive and healthy. Okay, so what was happening in the world? I'll quickly whiz through this because we want to keep... you're going to start this? Okay, so there was a bunch of things happening. An Eastern Airlines flight was diverted to Havana with 87 passengers. And Alan Funt, who used to run the candid camera, all the passengers thought it was some sort of stunt relating to his being on board, but it wasn't. It was a real hijacking. Just the good old days. February 9, there was the jumbo jet was flown for the first time, and it's just been now this year retired on a lot of airlines. And 17th of February, they had the Sea Lab, and this Aquanaut Barry Cannon was died as carbon monoxide poisoning. That was Sea Lab. What else was happening? 20th of February. Tricky Dick Nixon asked Congress to begin the process of abolishing the electoral... I put this in because I thought it was quite interesting, because this electoral college thing has been talked about now, about how distorted and wacky it is. But they were talking about modifying it back then, but it still hasn't changed. 22nd of February, once again, 69, the Vietnam War was raging. The final stage of the Tet Offensive was happening. And February 28th, the guy that shot Robert Kennedy was put up on trial, and he actually pleaded for the death penalty, but they didn't give it to him. That was that guy there. What was happening in Australia? Well, 9 passengers were killed in the Southern Aurora Express train that the guy had drive out of a heart attack and had a crash. Pretty sad. And February the 19th, the Casey Station was established back down in Antarctica. All right, so let's have a look at Apollo. What was happening with the Apollo mission itself? Am I okay?
Yes, stand close to the
Right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so Apollo, we'll have to do the next one, how about that? 5th of February, I'm not going to go through every line here, you can read that yourself, but basically there was a whole bunch of stuff happening around the Kennedy Space Centre, stages being shipped across, being stacked, being rolled out to the pad, etc. So the second stage for Apollo 11 had arrived at Kennedy Space Centre on the 5th, and the instrument unit was on its way, etc., etc. The actual lunar module ascent stage was being moved from the work stand to a cleaning positioner at the operations building. Neil was practicing his landings over the Lunar Research Facility on the 12th of February. Back at Kennedy Space Centre, they were stacking the Apollo 10 command and service module. Apollo 9 was already out in the pad, as we talked about last week. The Apollo 9 crew, which is the next manned mission, they did a press conference talking about their mission and what they were going to be doing. So this is the crew members here. The 11th of February, Apollo 10 spacecraft was lowered atop the instrument unit in the VAB, so that was being stacked, ready to go. In the adjacent work station, they were preparing to stack the Apollo 11 vehicle. February 11th, Apollo 9 did a wet test, demonstration test, which is loading propellants and draining them out, and then they had a dry test of all the other procedures. Back at, is it Houston? Yes, at Houston, and in Cape, the Apollo 9 crew were practicing in the simulators with the Apollo 10 and 11 going in and out after them. So obviously the Apollo 9 crew had the priority because they were going to go next. This is the lunar module simulator, Rusty Swigert going in there for some simulator work. Back at the VAB on the 17th, the second stage, the Apollo 11 second stage, was lifted and put onto the launcher. And they'd been working continuously on refurbishing that, because that launcher was used for Apollo 8, which happened in December, if you remember, last year. And they had cleaned up the pad and fixed all the damage, etc., that was happening there. February 17th, they were back in the simulator and training with the lunar module and command module as well. This was an interesting little fact. They received well, it wasn't a fax, it was a telegram signed by 10,000 residents from the home of Jim McDivitt, and they brought it in and they ran it from the top of the simulator down. So out at the pad, Apollo 9 astronauts were doing their countdown demonstration test, which is where they suit up, go out to the pad, get loaded in, do all the procedures around that to make sure everything's connecting, working, functioning, locking up, pressurising, etc., etc. February 24, Lovell, Hayes, Armstrong and Aldrin were out in Texas doing some EVA and geology sort of practices and photographing stuff and checking all their procedures and how they would do that. February 25th, they're back in the simulator. And this is an interesting little one, the mobile quarantine facility, which, remember, we see after the Apollo 11 landing, the astronauts were put into the facility and isolated. They were doing tests on that. So this is basically the quarantine facility being loaded onto a plane, and they hoist it onto the USS Guadalcanal. And on the Guadalcanal, they were preparing and practicing all the procedures of connecting the flexible tunnel between the quarantine facility and the capsule itself, etc., etc. Then it was on board the USS Fox. Then it was taken over and they did some pressure tests because, of course, with the mobile quarantine facility, they had to stay in it. They were loaded in it on the aircraft carrier, but then they were flown back to the States. So they had to check to make sure that the quarantine facility was going to be able to hold pressure in case the aircraft they were flying in lost pressure. So they had to put into an altitude chamber and run it full that. And they had some dummy astronaut volunteers to go in there and see if they survived, which was kind of good. I don't know whether they got extra pay for that or they just got to keep the blue suits, I'm not sure. So February 3, on the sort of the administration side, NASA HQ released a 12-month forecast. This is quite interesting. Apollo 9 would be going in February 28. That was the original launch date they were aiming for. Sounds like NASA's calling now. Apollo 10 was going to be May 17. Apollo 11, they haven't put a date on that, but that's kind of what they were going to do. So they were in 12 and 13. So the idea here is, of course, they wanted to meet this deadline, the end of 69. So they basically had 3 opportunities. If Apollo 11 had a problem, they'd try again with Apollo 12. If Apollo 12 had a problem, they'd try again with Apollo 13. As we all know, that changed because Apollo 11 was successful and Apollo 13 went into 1970, but that's another story. But you can see how they're really stacking up the program and trying to make sure that they had the best possible chance of beating Kennedy's deadline. So February 22nd, the Apollo 9 countdown actually officially begun. So this was going to be the first checkout of the Lunar module with people inside it. It was only going to be Earth orbit, but they were going to be going around replicating all of the functions, turning around, docking, extracting the Lunar module, putting crew in there, separating, discarding the descent stage, coming back to the command module, basically replicating all the procedures that would be required for a moon mission. So I've just done it really quickly because we've got a very exciting presentation from Mark. So we're going to head back to 2019, but I just wanted to find out if anyone knows what this is. Some space geeks in the room will. This is computing in 1969. This is the read-only memory, rope memory that was woven into the computers on the Apollo 11 vehicle. That's how they programmed the computers. So now we do our transition back to 2019, and we'll have a look at some memory from 2019. So this is kind of what we're using these days, and actually you'll probably correct me and say it's out of date anyway, but high-speed memory, of course, all the stuff we're used to. So that was our quick look. So the next meeting, we'll be looking at Apollo 9 if it goes, and these are the Apollo 9 astronauts in the Lunar Module simulator. And with that, that's the end of this month's episode of the Apollo Countdown. And I have come in 28 seconds ahead of time, so I have my dinner now. So now I'm going to hand over, if you're ready, Mark, to the Soviet moon program with Mark Hillyer. Thank you. That's all you need? You after that? Is that ready to start?
It's not up there.
So there's the resi thingy and the laser pointer.
Yep. So stand pretty close to here and make sure you hold this microphone up near your mouth.
As well.
Yep. So this one's just for the stream.
Yeah.
There's too much noise from the other rooms. I'll give you a thumbs up.
Excuse me. Sorry, a bit of a frog in my throat today, so I'll probably have to be clearing it a number of times. Okay. Oh, got a good audience tonight and a bit of competition, so see how we go. Okay. Just tie in with what Peter was talking about of February 1969. The most significant event in the Soviet human space lunar exploration program was, of course, the failure of the first launch of the N1 booster. And that was about it. So I'll get into the main thing. I've called it. Sorry, get myself coordinated between these things. I've called it Poikhali Oy. Now, the first word is something that Yuri Gagarin was supposed to have said when he was launched on his first mission on the first Vostok, which is basically, off we go. And the Oi bit was roughly translated to "Dol," as you'll see as we go through the talk. Which one's the? Is it this one for advancing the slides? Mm-hmm. Sorry, the slides?
So just that way. So
Yeah.
there we go.
Is that right? It's popped up in the menu. It's not touch.
There we go.
All right.
There you go.
That's it. Okay. Yeah, it had the pop-up menu. Okay. All right. You've all seen this one in the context of leading up to tonight's talk. And of course, that was a famous front cover on Time magazine in 1968, leading up to the Apollo 8 flight of the American astronaut and the Soviet cosmonaut racing for the moon. Well, the actual reality in the Soviet Union was probably a little bit more like this, which was actually back from the 2016 American election, where it was pretty much a three-legged race like this between two lead designers competing with each other and sort of cooperating, and then being shackled by the various vagaries of the Soviet system. So yeah, I think that's a bit more like their side of the race. So what I'm going to do first is talk a bit about the political, government and cultural background, because with the American, and I suppose most Western systems, but certainly with the American program, the Apollo program, we had the preconditions that they'd actually created NASA as a government administration that was responsible for the administration of the various space programs. And they were tasked with the Apollo program when John F. Kennedy made the commitment to go to the moon. Well, in the Soviet Union, they never had that. They only started to get close to it when everything was falling apart in 1965, but it even took a lot longer than that to actually get a lead organisation. And even Russia these days still has a lot of the legacy of how these things were organised and structured. So just a few basic things that in the Soviet system you had three, I suppose, key organisations. One was the Communist Party, one was what was effectively at different times called the Council of People's Commissars, and then later the Council of Ministers, which is more the executive side and the operational side. And you also had the Parliament, but that was more of a rubber stamp of what was approved by the Communist Party and the executive bodies. And within that, you had the various organisations that were supplying to the customers. I'll explain what that's all about. So at various times through the history, they were called People's Commissariats. For most of the time we're interested in, they were ministries, but there was a short period where some of the organisations were called state committees. And the customers they were serving were primarily the military, certainly in the context of the organisations we're talking about. So the Army, the Navy, the Air Force and other services. To some degree the Academy of Sciences, but they weren't a major player really in the Lunar program, except for certain parts of what they were doing. And as I said, there was no real NASA, so there wasn't really a customer organisation that the companies building the rockets, the spacecraft and all that sort of thing were supplying, which meant it was pretty much a headless chook in a lot of ways. Now there was an umbrella organisation called the Military Industrial Commission that had overall responsibility for determining requirements, both from the customers, so the Air Force and the Army and so on, and also the organisation supplying service and equipment and so on. It was also very hierarchical. So of course in the West we're used to independent commercial organisations, Boeing and so on, and they would all be competing for contracts to supply NASA in this case. In the Soviet Union, well, it was all a command structure. So the equivalent of the companies in the West, so design bureaus, research institutes, the factories, were actually owned and managed by the ministries that we were touching on before. And the key things we're talking about are research institutes, which would do studies, research in the space and the aviation fields. They were the ones who actually have all the wind tunnels and most of the test facilities. Then you have the design bureaus, which were the organisations that were the research and development through prototypes. Sometimes they had a little bit of production capacity as well. And then ultimately you have the factories where things are assigned. So if you're building a new aircraft or whatever, it'll be assigned to a particular factory. And they'll quite often have a little design office that's there to make sure the production's running smoothly, look at improvements. But sometimes those would be expanded and become actual research and development organisations as well. And some of the customers, like the military, had their own research institutes that could also be involved in studying things, researching things, testing things, and so on. Now, one of the lead characters we'll be talking about will be the chief designers. These are the people that headed up the design bureaus. Now, sometimes they would have a separate, effectively CEO, but most of the time the chief designer was not just in charge of the designs, but actually the management of the business. They had a lot of power of influence in the period we're talking about, because back in the days of Stalin, fear was a big factor of whether you did the job properly and whether you went to the gulags. Through the 50s and into the 60s, it sort of started to free up a little bit more, which left it open to various types of corruption and patronage and influence. So again, the key players we're going to be talking about primarily Sergei Korolev and Vladimir Chalamet. A lot of what was going on was how much influence they had and how much support they had from various kingmakers and key players within the Communist Party and the government. Now, the other thing that was always a little bit strange, and I don't think a lot of people understand, is being a command economy, it meant that budgets were set 5 years out and approvals had to be made, and the government had to free the funding up to go to all these different organisations. But the chief designers of these design bureaus also had very large discretionary budgets. And it really was there for innovation, but most of the time it meant they had a little bit of a pool of money to dip into if the government wasn't paying the bills. Now we move into more specifically what would these days be termed the missile and space industry in the Soviet Union and later Russia. Now most of the histories date the start of that industry to 1946, which was the year where, under Stalin, a number of major decisions were made on where a lot of the military and research budget was going to be invested. Obviously things like development of nuclear weapons, but in our story it's about the development of missiles. Now, within the industries that were involved, there were two key players. There was the defence industry and there was the aviation industry. Now, why is there a difference? Defence was generally supplying, I think I might say it on the next slide, defence industries were basically the munitions industry, and they were supplying primarily the army. The aviation industry, of course, was supplying the Air Force. And then you had the different design bureaus and factories within those areas. And really the only true customer for these people in the late 50s and early 60s was the military. So again, Air Force, Army, Navy and so on. Spaceflight and human spaceflight became more just an opportunist thing. And then in the early 60s, when the Soviet government started to realise, hey, people are interested and they think we're really good because we're launching things into space. They still didn't get some sort of a direction, an organisation, what was going on. So it was very much up to the lobbying and the patronage and the influence of the chief designers, who were effectively evangelists of things like development of technology, going to space and so on. But it meant everything was just so blurred, and responsibilities were very sort of, again, blurry, at least through to 1965. So within the defence industry, it had different names during various times, but it had the responsibility from 1946 for the development of ballistic missiles. So starting off with the German V2 and launching some V2s and then copying the V2s and then starting to develop new things. That was all within the Ministry of the Defence industry, which meant it was organisationally, historically and culturally supplying the army, and was primarily had a background in artillery. Space activities just sort of came by default, because the guy that ended up running most of the development of the ICBMs in 1950, from 1950s onwards, was this Sergei Korolev. The aviation industry, different ministry, different design bureaus, different factories, and primarily a different customer, mainly the Air Force. Now, the Air Force in the Soviet Union wasn't really interested in ballistic missiles when it all started coming out at the end of World War II. But what they were interested in was winged missiles, cruise missiles, and ultimately aircraft weapons as well. And later in the 50s, they also started getting involved in early concepts for winged spacecraft. So think in terms of something like the American Dinosaur program. The other thing that sort of is very important to the story is these two different areas had very different cultures and very different approaches, and they were very dismissive of each other. It's like the farmers and the cowmen in the famous song. It was the artillerymen versus the aircraft men. Excuse me. So in the aviation industry, when they were developing things, it was generally developing a set of requirements with the research organisations, developing the actual layouts of aircraft and the aerodynamics and everything within the lead research institute, Tsagi. So that's where you quite often, through the 50s and 60s, had 3 or 4 or 5 different design bureaus designing aircraft that looked very similar, because there was a basic concept, basic layout and aerodynamics that was the focus at the time. And then they'd got the different organisations to compete in design, and all the way through to developing prototypes. And sometimes they even ordered 2 or 3 different competing aircraft, and they had them in the Air Force at the same time. Now, that meant there was the parallel development of the prototypes and the fly-offs, which the US was doing at the same time through the 50s and 60s, and to some degree in the late 70s and 80s. But there was also scope for innovation to come in and new ideas. So as an example of this, the famous MiG-15 of the late 40s, early 50s, there were a number of aircraft very, very similar to the MiG-15, and the MiG-15 was just happened to be the winner because it just did things a bit better than the competitors from Sukhoi, Lavochkin, Yakovlev and Alexeyev. Later on, when space-type things started coming in, it was still happening. So a number of the aviation organisations were tasked with developing concepts. So one was the dinosaur-type winged spacecraft, none of which ever flew. Winged cruise missiles, starting with this guy Chalamet that we're going to be talking more about. Even competing they weren't quite sure whether ICBMs would work, which is what Korolev was working on. So there was a sort of a backup program in the aviation industry, because they were hoping they could say, oh, we can do better than the missile people, to develop very large winged cruise missiles. Now, as soon as the first ICBM flew successfully, all these projects were shut down. And it's an example, the only one that actually got to flying, and even though the program was cancelled, they completed its whole test program. Now, Khrushchev in particular, coming in as the head of the Soviet Union in the late 50s and early 60s, was very much won over by the idea of missiles replacing aircraft. So a lot of the aviation industry was reduced, contracts were cancelled, and people were redeployed to develop missiles. Within the defence industry, the Lead Institute was organised in 1946, and then within that it had a number of design bureaus or design officers that were tasked with the different elements of developing the ballistic missiles and rocket engines and guidance systems and so on. Now, being a research and development organisation, once they got to the point where they were successfully, or if they had got to the point of successfully testing something, it would then be made operational, assigned to a factory. Let's see. So, as I said before, there wasn't really a space industry as such, and there wasn't a lead organisation as such until about 1965. Then Khrushchev was deposed in 1964. There was a big shake-up of the industries and the organisations, and it was actually in 1965 that they organised the wonderfully named Ministry for General Machine Building, which became the Space Industry Ministry. So organisations from the defence industry and the aviation industry were moved across into this field. And ultimately, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Ministry for General Machine Building became Roscosmos. So the main organisations, Korolev is OKB1, originally part of that research institute. Later on, 1956, it was spun off as an independent organisation, and because he was starting to be very successful with the development of the missiles, his organisation absorbed a couple of other organisations who had factories and more staff. But once he started having a bit of success with space, they started taking the military stuff away from him and assigning to other organisations. And then a little bit later, they did the same thing with the robot Lunar and Planetary spacecraft that were developed by Korolev's Design Bureau. And they were spun off into an independent organisation. Then there's this other guy, Talabat, who came from the aviation industry and got very early into the idea of cruise missiles back during World War II. Now, he had a lot more support from the aviation industry, and then as the aviation industry started realising there was something to this whole missile thing, he was perfectly positioned to capitalise on it. And then when they started shutting down some of these aviation design bureaus, they gave them to him. So his organisation became a lot bigger. But it also meant he started getting onto the other organisations, the defence industry's turf, because he started proposing missiles, ballistic missiles, and space projects. Now, if we move on to the actual, what was going on. Sergei Korolev, the guy I mentioned, being the head of the lead organisation for the development of ballistic missiles, and when the first one flew successfully over its full range in 1957, he already had some concepts that he then went to the government with and said, hey, if you give me half a dozen of these things, I can launch satellites, put them into space. So we get Sputnik, Sputnik 2, Sputnik 3, and then getting onto the first small lunar probes, sent and missed a couple of times, but to crash onto the moon. So very quickly he came up with the idea, and it was in the climate anyway, because of course America was talking about setting up NASA, and then initial concepts for the Nova booster and then the Saturn boosters and going to the moon and so on. So it was in the air. So he always had concepts and ideas. So he then started putting it together a very specific plan. And there were certainly lots of different studies, but the first concrete one was in the 1960 to 62 period, where he set out 5 basic programs. One, the L1, which was a 2-person circumlunar flight. The L2, which was lunar surface rovers, which became the Lunar spacecraft. The third was the manned lunar landing program. And then the 4th one was sort of an extension of that, of far more extensive research from lunar orbit. And then ultimately I love this one, a 3-man heavy self-propelled craft that they could drive around on the moon for about 2 or 3 months. Now, competing with that was, I think I've got that one slightly out of order, that should have been before. There was a 3rd design bureau that also competed with concepts for big boosters, Untitled, but that really didn't go ahead, though. Ultimately, he was the guy, or his organisation was one that built the Soviet lunar lander spacecraft. Oops, I'm going the wrong way, that's why. Okay, now then. All right. Kolyev's concept from those 5 overall projects, he focused mainly on 1 and 3, which was the circumlunar flight and the lunar landing flight. And it evolved to a 3-part spacecraft. Now I've got a couple more listed there, but I'll explain what it's all about. So the main one they were working on was a thing called the Soyuz complex. And that was made up of 3 spacecraft, because those days he hadn't had approval to build big boosters, so he was working on Earth orbit rendezvous. So the first spacecraft was the 7K, which was the Soyuz, and then there was the Soyuz B, which was effectively an upper stage, and then there was the Soyuz V, which was a tanker. Because the idea is they would take 6 launches on the Soyuz booster to send up the Soyuz spacecraft, send up the upper stage and dock it with the Soyuz spacecraft, and then send up 3 to 4 refueling flights to refuel the stage that they'd sent up there. And then the stack of the Soyuz spacecraft and this upper stage could then launch towards the moon. Now that would just be purely a fly around the moon. There was another concept a little bit later, which is why I've got a couple others there. There was another type of tanker, but that was for flying the lunar rover. Again, would have been launched on the smaller Soyuz boosters, assemble in Earth orbit, and then send it off to the moon. There was also the concept of what was called the N1 booster. And that was going to be the next, the really big booster. But at that stage, it was 3 stages, and it would launch 75 tons to Earth orbit. But they were still thinking in terms of Earth orbit rendezvous. So it would take 3 launches of this N1 booster. 1 to get the various spacecraft up there, 1 to get the stage that was going to fire them off to the moon, and 1 to refuel that stage, and then launch the crew separately on a Soyuz booster. So again, a lot of docking in space before going towards the moon. And in this one, the N1 booster was not to be man-rated, because they're going to fly the cosmonauts up on at that stage, hopefully the more reliable, smaller booster. Oops, that way. Okay, so that's an early diagram they had that up on the top is what became the Soyuz spacecraft. The one in the middle is the stage, and the one at the bottom is the refueling craft. Now, in competition, Chalamet in the aviation industry came up with his own concept, because he was developing a series of ICBMs, and developed and got the government to pay for the development of this massive thing called the UR-500, which was way too big and impractical to deliver nuclear weapons. But it provided an ideal basis for a new medium-class booster. So he came in and said, okay, I've got my own concept for a lunar spacecraft to fly 1 person around the moon. Excuse me. Launched just on the one booster. None of this Earth or rendezvous or refueling or anything like that. So that's the basic layout. And they actually did build a fairly high quality mock-up of the whole thing. And the actual design of the re-entry vehicle up the top was then retained when he developed the TKS spacecraft, which became part of the Soviet Almaz military space station program. Now, his proposal at that stage was it would require 12 R&D and unmanned flights to prove the system and man-rate it, and then fly up to 10 missions around the moon. Oh, that's just an illustration of the TKS that I was talking about, which started development in around about 1965, 66. Never flew people into space, but a number of unmanned missions were flown, and then some of them became the basis of some of the modules on the Mir space station and even the International Space Station. So there was an original approval to develop the N1 booster, but there was also an N2 booster which didn't go anywhere. And that was in 1960. 1962, it was all reviewed and approved, but a couple of slight changes. The N1 booster had become really the idea of getting towards the idea of lunar orbit rendezvous, which the Americans went with. Khrushchev at the last minute decided, well, we're not going to approve any payloads for it, including flying people to the moon, but I do want you to build this huge platform to deliver nuclear weapons from space. So they had approval in 1962, but only for the booster. Now, one of the things that sort of jumps out of all of this is almost the irony that the Soviets got the head start by having boosters that could put lots of weight up into space. But by the time they started designing this N1 booster and then the next set of issues that we have a look at, it's actually very inefficient. So something so big, at the end of the day, it was only going to land about 6 tons on the moon with one person on board, compared to, of course, Saturn V and Apollo landing a larger spacecraft and two astronauts on the moon. And then they decided, okay, we're going to go away from that Earth orbit rendezvous and assembly, and we're going to go for lunar orbit rendezvous, but we're going to try to keep it to one launch. So the N1 was upgraded to 90 tons to low Earth orbit, but they were pretty stuck with the design that it took 3 stages to get that payload up into orbit. Now, once it's in orbit, what's going to happen? Well, in the past, we would have added these other spacecraft and refueled them. Now we've got to fly it all up in one shot. So we ended up with 3 extra stages. So a 4th stage, a 5th stage, and then a 6th stage, which was effectively the lunar lander and ascent stage. And even more bizarre, the 5th stage, Block D, because in the Cyrillic alphabet, it's A, B, C, D, V, G, yeah. So that's why we go directly from A, B to V to G. So they're the labels used for this spacecraft. So the Block D, which was the 5th stage, was the one that was going to be used to do lunar orbit insertion, circularization of the orbit, and also start the descent. And then the lunar spacecraft separates, and this stage crashes. So all this extra weight that they're carrying, all these extra stages, just added to the inefficiency of the spacecraft, or of the whole thing. That meant they had very narrow margins on how they could do things, which, yeah, if the Americans thought they had problems with saving weight, no. So 1964, that was all approved and started, but they actually decided to approve 2 separate programs. One was the Circumlunar program, which was the one that was recommended by Chelomane, and a lunar landing program, which was the Korolev one. And of course, you can imagine the sort of sniping between the two parties of saying, why are we diverting our budgets by having two parallel projects? Now, Korolev had actually lost interest in the idea of doing just around the moon, but he couldn't let it lie. He had to have a project to compete with the other guy's one that had just been approved. So he took a stripped down Soyuz and put it onto a thing he called the N2, which at this stage, the N2, unlike what we used to in the West, where you might have a first stage, then put a second stage, and then try different third stages, the Russians were proposing the opposite approach. So there was an N1 booster which had 3 stages. There was an N2 booster which was just the second and third stages. There was an N3 booster which was just the third stage. So you can just imagine, second and third stages, the engines are optimised for vacuum and altitude. Now you've got to make them start work from the ground. So they just keep adding to the technical hurdles that they've got to get through. So that was all approved, but again, the funding wasn't flowing, the commitment wasn't there. So not much happened between 1964 and 66, and then in 1965, then the other things that were happening, that the design of this huge N1 booster had assumed the development of different ground test facilities and test programs. Like, for example, Korolev's organisation developed this big ICBM called the GR1, and he was going to have a version of that to do the first tests of the engines from the Kuznetsov organisation that were going on the N1 booster. And he didn't get funding for these things, and the GR1 got cancelled. So on top of everything else, they weren't going to have the test facilities to do things properly. So they go to good old, just launch everything and hope it works. And if it doesn't, we'll just launch it again until we get it right. So the N1 itself, 3 major stages that gets the whole payload stack to orbit. That's the version that's got the Lunar spacecraft and the Lunar landing spacecraft. But the other three stages are all inside the payload shroud. Oh, just a photo of that GR1 booster, ICBM. Just a couple of photos, the N1 in the assembly hall. 2 on the pads. There's all sorts of versions of this photo around. And when it first appeared, everyone thought they were fake, but they're actually real. One's a real booster, and the other one was the sort of test article they used to check out the launch pad. This was pretty much the first reconnaissance satellite image that the Americans got back in 1967, but only declassified about 20 years ago. But it gives an idea, and if we've got time, we'll see in the video the 3 flame trenches out of the 3 angles. It must be a camel. We get to 1965, the lead organisation goes through and reviews these different projects, and they cast a lot of doubt on Chalomey's LK spacecraft and Korolev's N2. So someone came up with the idea of taking the concept Korolev offered of the stripped down Soyuz and putting it on Chalomey's Proton rocket. So the 2 organisations now have to work together on this one project. So that's what was ultimately approved. And because it was coming from the aviation industry, they just took the approach of, we are going to do things methodically, step by step. They also cancelled the 4th stage that Chalomey had proposed for the to fly his spacecraft, and they took the 5th stage off the N1 booster and put it on top of Chalomey's rocket. So another degree of integration that's got to go on. Now, later on, that actually started being used in some of the other programs, like the Lunar Sample Return, the Lunar Rover, and so on. And versions of that stage are still flying on Protons these days. But it had a long, torturous process to get it working properly. So basically we had the Soyuz without its orbital module, stuck on top of the 5th stage of the Ed-1. The little collar on the front was just a support structure for the shroud and the escape tower. There's a photo of it being rolled out. So on the Proton booster for the unmanned flights that were labelled Zond in the Soviet Union. No one's ever said what the program would have been called if people had flown on it. And then on the pad. Now, just a couple of things that are at this stage. That really, it was never a race to land on the moon because the Soviets were handicapping themselves almost all the way along the way. And even though there were government decrees that said, oh, you must land on the moon by 1967 or by 1968, it was never going to happen. But it was only really about 1968 that they started realising that that was the case. So they knew that they were going to get there after the Americans. Of course, they were hoping the Americans would fail and cancel their program, but it was going to take a lot more time. Where the real race was happening was with this camel of the combination of the Korolev spacecraft with the Chalamet booster around the moon, just flying around the moon. So the methodical approach, the original goal was to have 10 successful unmanned flights before putting people on board. Later on, they got that down to 5 or 6 because they actually had built confidence in a reasonable amount of time. But it does contrast quite a lot to just how reckless the Soyuz program was. The most obvious one was Soyuz 1 with the death of Vladimir Komarov. But that was flown after 2 unmanned missions that didn't really work very well. And they still went ahead with a spacecraft that had systemic failures. Whereas in these ones, they actually went through the steps. It just took a little bit longer than they expected, and the Americans just beat them around the moon with Apollo 8. Pretty much talked about that. Yeah. Just very quickly as a chart there, the stuff in blue was the stuff related to the flights of this L1 spacecraft around the moon. The ones that actually flew and were recognised by the Soviets without people on board were labelled Zond. Now, the first 2 failed, but they weren't real full spacecraft. They were testing high apogee and high G return, simulating return from the moon. And they sort of worked. And then they start actually going through that sequence of doing the 10 to 12 unmanned flights to prove the concept of the spacecraft. Now, first one had a launch failure with the first stage, second one had a launch failure with the second stage, and then it was only on the third, it only took the third flight to actually get a success. Now this one didn't actually go around the moon, it just went on a very high apogee. And again, to prove the spacecraft, prove the heat shield could stand the re-entry. Next one was a launch failure, a second stage launch failure. And then Zond 5 and Zond 6. Now, they were a couple of years behind schedule at this stage, but that was largely not just because of the booster failing, because they kept relaunching or launching, but it was production problems with the spacecraft that delayed different aspects of it. But through 1968, they ended up with Zond 5 and Zond 6 successfully flying around the moon in an unmanned mode, initially doing a ballistic return and landing in the Indian Ocean, and then doing the more advanced one, which is where they do a skip re-entry. So come into the atmosphere, slow down, skip out again, come back down again to land in the Soviet Union. I've got a couple other ones that aren't part of that program, which were the Lunar and Mars ones. But they were being developed in parallel. And they were the ones that actually started having trouble with this stage that had been added on that was part of the N1 booster. So it didn't really affect the manned one, but it did affect the planetary and lunar ones, through to beginning of 1969. Oh, I think I got the wrong date there. Yeah. Beginning of 1969 with... No, sorry, it's right. Beginning of 1969, there was a launch failure, and that actual Zond spacecraft, that L1, was the one that the Americans were most worried about, because they were going to launch it at the beginning of December, and there was quite a bit of lobbying from the cosmonauts to say, let us fly, because we'll beat Apollo 8 to the moon. But in this case, the industry said, no, we've got to go through all the steps, we've got to do it all properly. And then it was launched in January of 1969 without people on board, and that was a launch failure. But later in the year, Zond 7 was the next one that did a full circumlunar flight, automatic mode. And then the last one was Zond 8, which was in 1970. But really, by the beginning of 1970, they'd cancelled the program, because the Americans got there first.
Just
Yep.
go back. You've got
Yep,
Lunar
sorry.
15 with a successful sample return in July of 69.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I should have changed that to a partial. Except it successfully got to the moon.
Yeah, right.
Hit the moon pretty
Yeah,
hard.
it just crashed.
Okay.
So the booster worked, the lunar injection worked, all that sort of thing. It just crashed.
So some of the projectiles may have come back to it.
No. So I've pretty much gone through that. One thing that was really interesting through all those different launches, even the ones that failed, and a couple of the pad, one near pad explosion and one early in the flight, the launch escape system always worked, and it always recovered the spacecraft. So that they've always got that one right. It's photos on 5, the descent module, which was interesting because the Soviets released this photo very early after the flight, but it took them years to admit what the Soyuz looked like. But as soon as people saw this, they thought, yeah, that's going to be the Soyuz. So, as I said, there'd been lobbying by the cosmonauts, it wasn't approved, but the concern from the US intelligence community and NASA as that picking up pace of flying these circumlunar flights through 1968 was that extra impetus for the Americans to say, hey, we can do the Apollo 8 mission to fly around the moon. And of course, some of the Zonds sent back Earthrise. This one was from Zond 8, a couple of years after Bill Anders did it on Apollo 8. Now, just very briefly, the main lunar program was the one that just kept dragging on, didn't get the funding. So there was the development of this, the full, sort of a heavy Soyuz, the one that was going to be equivalent to the US command and service modules to go all the way to the moon and to go with the lunar lander. It was launched on the N1. It was a single flight, so every now and then they would have to think about the idea of, now we can cut some corners by not putting people on board and launch a Soyuz to take them up and rendezvous in Earth orbit. So it would have been a mix of Earth orbit rendezvous and lunar orbit rendezvous. The other thing is none of these spacecraft had internal transfer tunnels. So for the cosmonaut to get from the command module, effectively, to the lunar module, had to do a spacewalk around to get into the lunar module, go and land on the moon, one person, get back up again, and then do another spacewalk to get back into the spacecraft to get back home again. So these were all elements that the Soviets had to test at some stage. So even though they got to the point where, and of course the lunar lander, so yeah, that was in 2016 at the London Science Museum. They had a real one on display. Illustration of the stacks, so the L1, the Zond spacecraft, with that Block D stage that was launched on the Proton booster. And over this one, the same stage, and in this case it's the 5th stage on the N1 booster. Then of course we had the Soyuz missions through 1966, 67, 68 and 69, which in a lot of ways was the Soviet Gemini, because it was the place where they would try out, practice all the things that needed to be done as part of this overly complicated lunar landing program. So they had to demonstrate 2 spacecraft docking together, they had to demonstrate transferring cosmonauts from one to the other through an EVA, and even the ones that did fly, they didn't even have the same docking system that the lunar one had. So there were several flights that were rescheduled a number of times and then cancelled, where they would do it all over again with the right docking system. So you think about all these different elements. So the N1 booster, they'd anticipated they'd have to fly it successfully 10 times, and maybe they would lose 4 or 5 of them. As it turned out, they did lose 4 of them. So the one in February 1969, which actually had a last-minute version of the spacecraft, because at the last minute they decided they would fly a lunar orbiter version of a Soyuz, but it was just this one that had done the circumlunar flights with a little engine module in its nose to get it in and out of lunar orbit. So there was one of those on the first flight of the N1, which was in February 1969, which failed about 70 seconds into the mission. There was another one that was launched with the same thing, the intention of flying a unmanned spacecraft around the moon and into lunar orbit, that was launched in July of 1969, and that's the one that some of the engines shut down just after liftoff, fell back onto the pad, destroyed the pad. The launch escape system worked. Then they had to do a bit of head scratching, so the next one wasn't until 1971, and again a failure. I think that was about 50 seconds into the mission. So the lunar orbit spacecraft, the lunar landing spacecraft, and that one was about 7 seconds short of first stage shutdown when the engines failed. So they lost that one as well. So I've skipped quite a few slides. Any quick questions?
Was it a 31 or 33 rocket booster?
Yep,
What was the
30.
chronology on that one?
I suppose the basic was most of the engine development was originally by Valentin Glushko, who was in the aviation industry, and he developed most of the engines for the early ICBMs. But for a number of reasons, there was a big falling out between him and Korolev, which has all sorts of roots back in the Stalin's terror and things like that. But also, Glushko felt the future was hypergolic fuels, so highly toxic, whereas Korolev didn't want to know about hypergolic fuels. So he ended up going to an aircraft engine design bureau, Kuznetsov. He'd started a little bit of work on rocket engines, but it did mean they effectively had to develop engines from scratch from about 1963 through to the first launch in 1969, with having only fairly limited ground testing. So there were problems, and a lot of it was the synchronization of the 30 engines. And that was the main thing that caused most of the failures. Stresses, or one was a control system problem, all those sorts of things. But they really felt that they'd sorted it out, and the 5th flight would have been it. And of course now, the engines that were supposedly destroyed when the program was cancelled and were all stored away had been flying Atlases. Though I did notice Elon Musk about 3 or 4 weeks ago with the first full firing of the Raptor engine has now claimed to have a higher chamber pressure than the N1 rockets. which for the last 50 years have had the record.
But he killed that particular engine in the process.
Yeah, it's only the first one. Yep.
Well, thanks, Mark. That was great. Yeah, so quite fascinating. A bit of a different impression I had. The West impression of the West was very much a neck and neck. They're going to do something, we're going to do something, but obviously the Mark explained it was a much more tangential, wiggly road to trying to go somewhere. So it sounds like a good episode of Utopia. All right, we're going to take a break. We're running as per normal, a little bit late, so we'll just take a 10-minute break and be back here at 8:35 for the second half. If you want to order something, get drinks or whatever, toilets are down there. Is there anything we need to say? Yeah. All right, we'll see you back in 10 minutes. Have a chat with somebody you haven't met before. Okay, stay. Okay, so we're going to get started on our second half of the show. And we're going to be looking at Russia in 2019. And we've got a special speaker, Dr Shane Usher, who's a Space Association member, and he's going to tell us all about his adventures in Russia. Over to you, Shane.
Thank you very much. So I'm here to tell you a little bit about my recent trip to Moscow to apply for a position on a long duration space simulation or analog mission, and as part of that we'll overview some of the long duration missions and plans and aspirations of the Russian people. So first of all, introduce myself. I'm a researcher, a chemical engineer at the University of Melbourne. I've always had an interest in space, engineering, science, and recently, just because of Elon Musk landing a rocket on a boat, I got enthused about space again and got myself involved in a few things. Something that the Russians liked. I have a history as a rower and some world records on a rowing machine, and I was silly enough to try to row across an ocean. I got a couple of Guinness World Records for my efforts, probably not deserved because after 31 days I had to be evacuated because I was burnt. But the rest of the guys finished, and yeah, it was a pretty interesting achievement being out there in the middle of the ocean, rescued onto a 120-metre tanker into one of those orange boats, and then into basically being jacked up on the side and smashing against, having the fiberglass crushing and things like that. But that was an interesting experience. So a little bit about my motivation. Basically, I'd like to see mankind move forward and have an enduring presence in space. And there's a lot of challenges, but I think quite possibly they're sorting out the transport part. So there's lots of other challenges that we need to get on with now. My involvement, I've had some little ideas about how we can reduce radiation exposure by exploiting scattering in addition to just absorption. I've been talking to Jonathan Clark about how we some experiments I can do in our lab with some vacuum ovens that we have. I'm a candidate for Mars Society's Boomerang mission later this year, which is at the Mars Desert Research Station, pretending to be an astronaut. I'm hoping that we can move the processes there forward to have more methods that can be applicable out in real space missions rather than the feeling of just playing. And I've put my hand up for what was a 4-month mission this year with the Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. So it's basically a research centre of the Russian Academy of Sciences, which was alluded to earlier, and they put this facility together, and it's basically a bunch of pressure vessels, and they call it the NEK. I can't pronounce what it is in Russian, so I'm not going to try. And it's for long-term analog space simulation missions. And this complex has hosted missions from 14 days to 520 days. Some of you may have heard of Mars 500, where they did a long-term isolation experiment. It basically has four cabins with lots of different sections which you might move through as you normally move through a mission. So you might have your initial launch vessel, and then you'll move into some kind of bigger spaceship or gateway or something of that kind. Traditionally, it's been used to look at Mars missions, which is quite interesting because I don't know how far off the Russian space program is in actually developing facilities that can send crews there. The one important thing is that limited crew size with their current fleet would limit them to a relatively small crew size. So most of their simulations are for crews of 6, which is sort of, from my understanding, probably the minimum reasonable crew size to cover all of the capabilities required, and also to ensure that you don't have too many tensions. One of the important features of this equipment is that it's externally controlled. That means that all the chemical engineering things that I'm really interested in, like the air control, the water treatment and things like that, they're all basically controlled externally so that the experiment isn't compromised or isn't at risk of compromise. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I might try to look at there. And you're also isolated because you're simulating a mission. You have low bandwidth in terms of communications and delay. For Mars missions, I think they had 20 minutes, but it's 10 to 20 seconds for the Moon mission, which is much more bearable. And they have another area which is basically a surface where you can get into your spacesuit and you walk around and have like a landing on the surface. I also forgot 78 cameras. This is real Big Brother. So I don't think they're in the showers, and they're not in your sort of dorm bedroom areas in the main cabin area. So what have they done? They've done a 1-year mission, a 240-day mission. Note that first one in 1967 to 1968. So they were thinking about this a long time ago. And Mars 500, in most famous mission in 2009 to 11, and recently they've embarked on a new program, Sirius, which is a bit of a collaboration with NASA, and they had a trial of 17 days this year. They have a 4-month mission, an 8-month mission next year, a 12-month mission the year after, and then they're hoping that they can have 12-month missions about every 18 months. Following on from there. So the current mission for this year is a deep space gateway analog, which is quite curious because the Russians aren't necessarily sure whether they want to be involved in that. But NASA is putting part of the bill for this one because the scientific committee is half Russian, half NASA with their human research program. They've set up a website, and they've not named the candidates on the website. And there's nominally 3 Russian, 3 internationals. They have 10 or 12 people currently shortlisted and in training, being guinea pigs, having lots of biomedical tests on them at the moment. And in mid-March, 6 of them will go in for 4 months. The process had over 100 applications, and normally 3 men, 3 women, 3 internationals, 3 Russians, 2 engineers, 2 doctors and 2 biologists. And I was on the 20 who were shortlisted for selection for this year, but a couple of issues. This year they have 7 Russians, 1 Belarusian and 2 Americans who NASA inserted at the last minute. I think, and they inserting the NASA crew members also came with a few extra conditions and stipulations about the height of the crew members, body fat, psychological testing, medical testing and a whole bunch of other things. So it was a bit of a process to go through. And I'm in there and I have to get used to my name being read out in Russian. There's a slight bit of an accent, so the Dr. Shane Usher. So it's not too far off. But a bit of an international bunch, and I went there to try and improve my chances, and met Dr. Mark Belakovsky, a hero of the Russian Federation. Now, this is a very big thing in Russia. They have heroes who they basically laud as genuine heroes. So anyone who goes into space is almost automatically a hero. But it permeates through the society, and people contribute to the society, and people recognise that. Whereas here in Australia, the Order of Australia is sort of this hidden little thing. So I was given some instructions about what I should do this year. Learn a bit of Russian, obtain an endorsement from an institution here in Australia, and bring some of my own research to the mission. So the question is what I could bring to the mission, with the chemical engineering stuff not really part of the deal. So I thought, what is it that's going to help me get through 8 months in isolation? And I thought, well, I want a proper exercise program. And that's something that I'll talk a little bit about if I don't go too slowly. Okay, so this is what the facility looks like. I normally pack my essentials as gifts to bring along there. And I figured 3 packets of Tim Tams and 3 jars of Vegemite should at least get me through a little bit. Portholes everywhere between each cabin. That's what you have. Now, Anastasia Stepanova was guiding me in translating the tour, and the first thing she did as we walked in was point out the freezers, 1 for each crew member to go into stasis, of course. So quite advanced technology there.
Not compulsory.
What was that?
Not compulsory, is it?
Well, I guess you could try the boring method. So there's plenty of storage for the food, the space food, lots of Bourke meals or some equivalent. The 180 centimetre height limit specified by Russia turned out to be quite relevant, because I'm 174 centimetres tall. They did send me a message quite concerned, because once that stipulation came in, because they said, because you're a rower, I guess this is a problem and you might be out of it. And I said, no, don't worry, I'm a lightweight rower, and people always think I'm the coxswain, not a problem. And so I tried out the bed, and I could point my toes and that, so I was stoked. Yes, Anastasia, I'm not sure that she's actually under 180. I think that they might have tweaked the figures a little, and she might have to sort of sleep sideways or something like that. Oh, yes, the other important thing in there, so they've installed specialised lighting throughout the whole system. So everyone knows with their screens on their computers now, you have a night light, and with they change the amount of blue and orange light in there. Well, we have the same thing with the lighting there, which can be externally controlled and internally controlled. So that obviously there looks like a brightness difference there, but I'm promised that there's also a hue difference as well, to help with your body clock while you're isolated indoors. Pretty rudimentary kitchen. I think the microwave is the cooking facilities, and but there will be an experimental greenhouse there, but I don't think it'll grow much in the way of food. There's a picture of the cameras there and some of the process control. You can see that from within a small control room area within the facility as well. They've changed the dirt. It's not Mars soil now, it's now moon dust. And I tried to make a footprint. Unfortunately, it wasn't fine enough, so the chemical engineer in me was very disappointed. It wasn't a Ross and Rambler distribution, and there was a reason given, and that is that fine dust interferes with the cameras. But they have a really lovely, you can turn the lights down, and it's a really lovely scenery there with all the mock faux stars. And they made sure that I did some of the touristy things. And we had some beer and vodka and borscht and at a Ukrainian restaurant. So, what's this exercise program? So traditionally you have a treadmill with some contraption. So in space they're actually trying to hold you down, make sure on a bit of elastic so you have some impact. In this scenario you're trying to reduce the gravity a little, so I think you're suspended a little to try to make it feel as though you have less gravity. And there's also an exercise bike and some kind of weights. And that's your traditional exercise, and it's basically ineffective on this space station. So everyone loses bone density and muscle mass. It is a major issue. And my hypothesis is that if you can add a rowing machine, which is very versatile in what you can do it low rating with high power, you can do fast, high rating work, you can do long distance for cardio. There's lots of options there to put stress on your bones without the impact of running, and also to build some muscle. So my hypothesis is that you might be able to maintain some bone density and muscle mass. And I want to demonstrate that and get rid of the myth that you can only maintain bone density with the impact of running. So that's what I want to try out. And I have some of my own theories about training and the like, from training with some people who, or coaches who've coached Olympic gold medalists and the like, and all the programs that they had adaptation, so you never really got used to any program, so that you didn't get into what you call a routine where you developed effectively RSI of doing the same thing again and again. If you change up, and I've been experimenting with that, where every time I go to jump on the rowing machine, I pick the straight line of my split versus my distance, and whatever is above that line, I'll say, okay, I'll do that distance, and whatever the average line is, I'll just aim for that. And that's something that I know is well within my capability, and it's not going to kill me. So, and I think that that'll be important for people who aren't necessarily used to the exercise, so they have an estimate of what their capabilities and bounds are, so they can do it, and their body won't be adapting by doing the same session every single time, and see if they can adapt that into some of their program. So in conclusion, maybe I'll get to Russia if I can get a few doctors, coaches, and biomedical engineers involved, and we might have a program, and I might be addressing you guys from Moscow in some kind of weird delayed teleconference. Thank you. Yes.
Why don't you just go and rob a bank and get sent to prison for 4 months?
I hear the gyms are pretty good in prison. So, as an alternative venue for this kind of research, it might be good, but ethics.
Given that some of the loss of muscle mass and bone density and so forth is due to lack of gravity, has your hypothesis essentially dealt with that?
Not 100%. But at the moment on the space station, they do nominally 2 hours of exercise per day. And they are limited in what they can do. They have what would be effectively a squat machine, which it doesn't have weights on there, it's more of a resistance. And they have the bike and they have the treadmill. And one of the key issues is that they really have no upper body workout going on there. And anything with a squat machine with that on your shoulder, all you're trying to do is hold your back in a strong position so you don't destroy it. So even there you're not getting mobility in your upper back. So you're not using your whole body. And rowing has the advantage of being able to do that. That said, it appears that your legs are the bits that really waste quite significantly. One of the things about the rowing machine is that instead of being with your legs sort of having all your blood pressure pushing down on your legs, it's not the same as being in space, but it's closer because your legs are relatively horizontal. So you're not pushing as much of the, our gravity into your legs. So we're not simulating space conditions. Having no gravity is a very, very difficult thing to do on Earth, but we can do things to get closer. And I know that, I've seen lots of pictures with what they do with the treadmill where they actually have them suspended, so they're bouncing a little bit more and simulating, which creates a bit more of an obstacle to maintaining your bone density.
So what's your motivation to want to do it?
Okay, so getting people into space and staying in space requires us to understand all of the physiological effects in addition to how to maintain your spaceship and keep the environment appropriate. And I figure that being involved in something like this would expose me to what the current state of the art is, and give me the knowledge about how we as a society can move us towards those goals.
So I saw a presentation a while ago, maybe more than a year ago now, about various sorts of suit designs for people in the space station. Essentially, a suit that would put positive pressure on the lower body to try and equalise blood pressure or whatever, so that blood would flow to the lower part of the body. Would it be worthwhile wearing an analogue of that sort of thing in the normal gravity situation, just to test out various aspects of it that aren't dependent on the low gravity?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, and my answer is I don't know, and that's for ethical reasons, because the question is it ethical to take the candidates and subject them to something that will definitely create a detriment to their bodies and have them try to counteract that? So I think there may be an ethical problem with creating that. I mean, you can do things within the experiment that create some stress as long as they monitor it and don't push it beyond certain limits. They can give you a little bit of sleep deprivation, monitor it, make sure your biochemical and physiological situation doesn't deteriorate. But there are limits and you have to be able to monitor it. But if you're going to cause a physiological damage to the person, I'd say the ethics would probably say no. Well, you could use that to actually. it's sort of like creating extra pressure on your legs, so it's creating the reverse, obviously. The reverse of what would happen in the space station. And the symptoms, like the swelling legs when you come back to Earth and that sort of thing, okay, you wouldn't get that, but I don't know, because it's like creating extra pressure on your legs, and I'm not sure that that's actually good for you.
All right, well, thank you for that. That was fascinating.
Oh, we're over 5 seconds.
Yeah, well, keep us up to date with your progress there, and we'll have you back when you're out of the deep freeze. And we'll try to keep you away from sharp objects. All right, so that's fantastic. Thank you, Shane. It was really fascinating. So now we're going to move over to our
Angelo.
news segment. Parts 1 of 2, and this is the enigmatic Angelo de Grazia. He's going to give us the latest update on space industry.
Start the timer when you're ready to go. 20 minutes?
Yep.
All right.
All right. Angelo,
Okay. Can you hear me? Welcome, everyone. My name's Angelo de Grazia. I'm part of management here, I think, or somewhere there anyway. This is a bit of a wrap-up. It's a lot longer than 20 minutes, but I will go only for 20. So let me just see if I can move forward. We start off with some Australian space news. Gilmore Space. He's announced a new rocket and launch platform ahead of a suborbital flight. He's actually not far away from actually doing this. Dave has some words about him, but he's an interesting character nonetheless. He's got this One Vision rocket and he plans to launch it later this month. It's probably been delayed. I haven't heard any news about it over the next few days. But it's he's got this thing that he calls a mobile launcher. Anyway, it's a 9-metre rocket, so it's got a little bit of substance to it, and that's what it kind of looks like. And this is the mobile launcher. So there you go. First in Australia. Might be second. Dave? There's another group called Equatorial Launch Australia. They were a little bit more interesting. They've secured a commercial contract to support the development of a local launch industry here, and they're really trying to put together a launch facility up in Arnhem Land. It's just located 12 degrees south from the equator, so it will help the Northern Australia. 12 degrees from the equator. Yes. It'll leverage the extra rotational velocity, obviously, and it competes to the one that we heard not long ago in South Australia. However, they're certainly not trying to get equatorial type launches. They were doing the polar type launches. So again, we're looking at some startups in 2019, and should be good. And they actually cut a deal with the local Land Aboriginal and Land Trust and granted a 40-year lease over 275 hectares of land, which is good. Fleet Space. Now, this is a company I'd not heard much about, but they've actually, they do what's called the Internet of Things, is it? And they basically have launched CubeSats into space. And the idea here is that companies who want to link things that are linkable do it via these little CubeSats. And what are these things? Refrigerators, cars, surveying equipment, mining equipment, and great idea, great concept, and there must be a lot of them in very outback areas which don't have a lot of communication. So this is a perfect solution, and this Australian mob from South Australia may have really been able to jump at a little niche in the market. So wish them luck, and this is the sort of CubeSat that you get, and this is the little tracking station that they've put up. So we'll hear more about them. Like I said, they launched on Falcon 9, SpaceX. They've launched on the ISRO launcher, and they launched on another rocket as well. Anyway, Rocket Lab. They're hiring. So maybe they've filled the positions, but they currently have about 20 employees. They want to get up to about 30. So if you've got any logistics abilities or anything and you'd like to move to New Zealand, this is a perfect job. Again, they're about to launch a rocket shortly. Andrew, no ETA?
No, but they've got the picture of the rocket on the pad at the moment.
Okay.
The same as 20 this month, isn't it? 28th?
28th, I think, yeah.
No time.
They launched clearly in a beautiful part of New Zealand along the east coast, but I suspect it's probably the windiest part of New Zealand as well. Anyway, good luck to them. Let's go to NASA and a little bit of space policy. President Trump formally approved a proposal to create the Space Force, but this one's got a little bit of a twist. It's now a Space Force under the Air Force because everyone was dead set against having a separate arm of the military. And this seemed to be the path of minimum resistance, hopefully to get Congress to approve it. The other interesting news is NASA continues to have increasing budgets. They've actually been awarded $21.5 billion for fiscal year 2019, which I think goes to September this year. I forget their fiscal year. It's September, October. Anyway, what normally happens is NASA puts in a bid, says we want X dollars, then Trump lowers it, and then it goes to the House and they increase it. I don't know if there's a deliberate strategy there, but this is what seems to be happening, which is good news for NASA if one believes that they spend money efficiently. And that's another story in itself. The next budget request actually is expected to be released next month, so we'll see what the banter on that is. International Space Station. The next Soyuz mission, MS-12, to the ISS may slip a month. Was February, but will be delayed probably till April. And it's really about the schedule to fly an astronaut from the United Arab Emirates. He was part of that crew, but has been moved or shifted. Next one, commercial resupply. Dragon spacecraft recently departed the space station, so we're getting kind of used to it. CRS-17 goes up in the next month, I think. And that's just part of the continuing contract that Elon Musk has with NASA to deliver cargo. But the big news is commercial space. A revised schedule of Soyuz mission. Now this is important. As you know, they've been trying to get American rockets flying, but to hedge their bets, the Americans are going to buy a few extra seats, extend a few missions with the Russians. A revised schedule could give NASA more time to certify the commercial crew vehicles, which are due for certification this year. NASA and Roscosmos are planning to stretch out the two upcoming missions. That's the first initiative. And the next one is, again, to the next page, is to buy more Soyuz seats. So that'll be interesting to see. And again, that hedges their bets. And it gives them time up until 2020. Just trying to look. Again, NASA was trying to have all these commercial crew flights certified by 2017. We're now in 2019 and it's still looking like a bit of a struggle. So the difficulty of the challenge, again, seems to have been underestimated. So where are we? Boeing is one of the commercial providers. They were given something like $4 billion some years ago to develop the CST-100, and it's now April 2019 for the uncrewed orbital flight test 1 from an Atlas. So that's April. In May, there's going to be a pad abort test. There won't be an in-flight abort test like SpaceX. In August, there's a crewed orbital flight test to the space station. And probably December will be when the first contract flight to bring astronauts to the space station would start. The schedules have been altered to allow for more time for hardware testing, training and reviews and certifications. Equally, and there it is. I'm not going to play this video. We'll talk about SpaceX because they're in the same boat. However, they fly on the 2nd of March, which is only a week and a bit away. And it was February, and it'll be flying out of pad 39A, which is the very historic pad, as you all know. In June 2019, they will be doing a in-flight abort, and interestingly enough, they'll be flying the 4th time this particular booster called B1048.4, which just launched the little Israeli lunar lander and the I think it was an Indonesian satellite. So it'll be the 4th time a Falcon 9 goes up, and the objective is to blow it up and have the abort system demonstrate its ability to clear astronauts from a failing rocket. July 2019, they're talking about the Crew Dragon. I suspect it all depends on how demonstration mission 1, as it's called, in a week, how it goes. In September, they may, if all goes well, so they will be qualified and start operational missions. Again, they've had this issue. And there's the Dragon. Now, just on that particular mission, the static fire occurred some weeks ago. Quite surprising, the difference between the static fire normally is about 2 weeks or so, and then they fire the rocket. But in this instance, it's been well over a month. So NASA has given a go-ahead to actually launch this thing. So for those that want to watch it, it's at about 7 o'clock or 7:15 Australian Eastern Daylight Time on March the 2nd. And it's an instantaneous launch window, which means if they miss the launch window in the first try, they've got to wait for another few days. Again, they will actually land the booster. So it'll be, again, interesting because it leads to the July launch of the first men from America since 2011, when STS 2011. Go on, Pete.
I think I know the answer, but so NASA has approved that quick refuel thing now, where astronauts get on the rocket, then they fuel, then they go, right? Which is a bit of controversy.
I don't know.
I'm asking the question.
I don't know. Dave?
They have, but they consider it the single highest risk factor of the SpaceX design at the moment.
Just to let you know, there's a number of critical items that both the companies have got. And some of them go back to parachutes, some go to the loading, the COP-Vs that are inside the Falcon. There's a whole series of these things. So whilst this is a test flight, to actually put men on board may be a whole different stretch. May not happen. Dave?
The other key safety concern they've identified is with the CST-100, which is a problem with the heat shield.
Yes.
So they're the 2 priority issues that they're working on.
Now the heat shields does come apart on that particular capsule because it has an airbag recovery. So God knows if it's all related to that. So there's still a number of hurdles to get through, even after the mission.
But they see that as a risk on the SpaceX, but they're launching next Saturday. They must have already made a decision.
They've made the decision
They've
to do
approved
it,
it.
but they still want more evidence from SpaceX that the cryogenic overwrap tanks are a solid technology.
Once it's failed, always not trusted.
Something like that. And the other issue is that NASA has currently requested that only new boosters are used for manned flights. So reused or flight tested rockets won't be allowed at this point.
And also only single male astronauts.
Anyway, there it is. That's the real deal.
Sorry.
And that was the test. Oops. That's all right. Always like that. SpaceX. Permit applications have recently been made by SpaceX that confirms that the company is planning its next Falcon Heavy launch no sooner than early March. That's the Falcon Heavy. So we're finally, a year after the first one, we're going to get a second one. So next month we'll see that happen, and I saw a picture the other day of some of the boosters heading for the Cape. Communication licenses for both the Falcon Heavy launch itself for the landings of 3 boosters. So they've got the license to do that. So 3 boosters, 2 will come back to land and 1 will come out, will land in the ocean on a boat, hopefully, on a ship. Arabsat 6A will be launched as the second flight of the Falcon Heavy. And there's another one coming up as well. So there's a couple coming up, and there's been another Swedish company has actually signed a contract to actually buy a ride on one of these. Mr. Stephen missed it by that much. I should actually show this. I haven't got much time, but I should show it. This is really good. They did a test. As you know, they're trying to recover these things. I think they're about $1 million a piece or something. Six each half, or a pair. $6 million. Okay, $3 million. So there's a lot of big incentive to recover and use these things. Normally they just land in the sea and they pick them up, and they've been talking about maybe reusing them with a little bit of salt water in them, but I haven't heard that definitively. But here it is. It's coming in on the parafoil, and it's controllable. And there's the ship trying to catch it.
No, don't. That was the mistake.
Only Elon Musk could think of something like this. The chief designer. Missed it by that much.
So there's not the
Mr. Stephen is the ship. So
another one which hit the back and then
yeah, there's another. There's a couple of pictures of this, but it's a shame. But they're still testing. But I then came across this, which I thought he's got this nailed. I'll show you this one. This makes more sense, right? It's like the old aerial grab. So you grab it before it actually hits the water, and you drag it along, you keep it in the air, and you move it back to the ship. This has got more of a chance of achieving the result. So there you go. Bit of lateral thinking. Very good. Move on. They recently launched that communications satellite, and of course one of them was the little Israeli Space IL, which was part of the X Prize, Bereshit, which means, I think, Genesis in Hebrew, and it made that rocket actually made its 3rd flight. Again, I think it's 2 now that have actually achieved 3 flights for a rocket. So again, as I said before, he'll use this for the flight aboard, and there it is. And it's not a huge thing, but you know, it's on its way to the moon. It's going to take a little bit of time to get there. Apparently, it just raises its orbits by firing. The other day or yesterday, it had fired its engines for the first time. It was due to fire again today. So, and there it goes. The other thing was the Raptor engine, as Mark said. It's the latest test of a flight version of the Raptor. Now, they've been testing Raptors since, 2016 and even earlier. It's just that this is the flight version that they're going to be putting on the hopper, and it actually did reach a chamber pressure of 269 bar, which is supposedly broke the record against the RD-180s, which is the Russian rockets which power the Atlas rocket. And it's still debatable which is the best engine in the world, but I've got the feeling the RD-180 still holds a number of key features that rank it to be the best. But there's also another one coming on the stream, which is the Blue Origin BE4. The engine is, interestingly, the engine is designed to run at 300 bar, but only 250 are needed for normal operation of the next generation Super Heavy and Starship vehicles. Okay, there it is. Now, these pictures are deliberately blurred. And they're deliberately blurred because when they take the pictures, they have to be. Because the American government will not allow release of sensitive technology in high-res pictures. Now, there's the comparison. There's the Merlins on the right-hand side, which are what power the Falcon 9. Then we have the Raptor, which is what's going to power the Super Heavy and Starship. And then we've got the BE4, which will power the New Glenn from, so you can see the comparison. BE4 is a pretty amazing engine as well. It's not. There's a whole series of these type of engines and what kind of cycles they use. The most efficient Raptor is in one of the most efficient classes of keeping everything internal and using every ounce of energy that they can get out of the system. I'm just flicking through some of these. Proposed wall across the Mexican border could pose a problem for SpaceX launch site. They're building their launch pad in Boca Chica near Brownsville, and apparently the next door neighbour is Mexico. So they had a few surveyors going down there looking for where to put the wall. So I thought that was pretty crazy. Anyway, this is what they're building. On the right you have the Falcon, in the middle you've got the Super Heavy and the Starship, and you've got the amazing Saturn V. Now, I've seen a Saturn V, and let me tell you, this other thing is going to be mind-blowing. 9-metre diameter. And there's the family tree. I'm just a couple of minutes late. I'll just finish this little section and then I'll stop. And you can see on the left, there's a star hopper. And here they are. I showed some of these pictures last time. They were building this thing. They had put the nose cone on top. They had some dummy engines on the bottom. And this was actually a promotional picture. The reason that this came out was because they were trying to get $500 million funding. Not funding, but raise money. They were trying to raise money at the time, and they put this picture to say, we're doing it. This was made by a water tank manufacturer. And it's stainless steel. Great material. There's a number of advantages, but I won't go through them now. One is a render, one is the real McCoy, and then a big wind came up, about 30 miles an hour, and knocked the top off. So they've got to rebuild it, but they have been putting in the bulkheads that create the fuel tanks, and that's work in progress. And this picture was probably a couple of weeks ago, and you can see the pictures daily from a lady that lives very close to this, and she keeps recording everything that's going on down there. So pretty amazing. And this is someone's vision. All right, I'm done. Thanks very much.
Is this what you're... That's the one? Okay, good. Never mind then. I'll give you a thumbs up when we're ready. Alright.
I'm waiting for the thumbs up. Good one. Just while we're waiting. Yeah, just while we're waiting. I do the radio program called The Space Show on Wednesdays on Southern FM. And radio person doesn't know how to use a mic. On this week's show, I'm commemorating the 60th anniversary of the launch of Pioneer 4, which gives a chance to mention Pioneer 3, 2, 1 and 0. And They were moonshots. Then, of course, it's 50 years ago, as Mark has just pointed out, that the Russians tried to launch the first N1 rocket. So again, we're looking at that program, the N1 program, and what it did. And I have some music about the N1. Yes, I have some music in English about the N1 rocket on the show. Okay. Last year, I think it was, did an infamous program on Telstar 1. And I had lots of records about Telstar 1, and I only got to play about half of them, or less than that. Well, I did an interview a few minutes ago, well, a couple of hours now ago, with a chap who's from Goonhilly. He worked at the Goonhilly station, and of course we talked about Telstar. So I'm going to have an excuse sometime later in the year to play more Telstar songs.
You should tell everyone how many versions of it there are. Too many. I think we counted 40 plus.
Yeah, no, look, about 30, I think.
And Andrew, I think, tried to play all of them.
Anyway, let's move on. I was too late, because I was doing those interviews with several people, I was too late to come here and mention Kate Doolan, so I'll do that now. Kate used to love ABBA, as you can see from the funeral card, and she always wanted this record, which is ABBA's Fernando on 45 RPM, and no, I'm not a great fan of ABBA, no great fan of any music, but I do like a wide range of music. I've got over 1,000 CDs and about 500 LPs, but that's the only ABBA record I have, although I do have a Laserdisc video of ABBA. Anyway, planetary missions. It's been a year since I last did a PowerPoint presentation, so what I'm going to talk about are the recently completed missions, current missions in space or on the planets, and then next month, the under development and construction and concepts approved, and I'm going to ignore any missions to the third rock from the sun. The idea is I'm going to work down the list. I could zigzag across, decided to go down, so I can do the recently completed ones, then the current ones, and then we've got future ones next month. All right. So, recently completed, Opportunity, which operated until June last year, but they finally declared it dead a few days ago. And Spirit, by the way, probably forgotten, died in 2013 or thereabouts. Now, so it's given up for dead on that date, and there's a very interesting session from JPL, which you can now get online. Another one that's died recently are Marco's A and B, and they were sent along with the InSight mission as sort of, well, call it CubeSats if you want, they're not cubic. And the last contact with Marco A was on January the 4th and Marco B on December the 29th. So they're dead. Now, minor bodies complete. You say, hey, Rosetta finished in 2016. That's not recent. But there's still data and stuff coming out about it, and it still lives on in my heart, so it's still recent. The Vesta mission to Ceres and Vesta are finished now officially, and that was in November last year. Cassini-Huygens still lives on in my heart, so I call that recent, finished in 2017. But data and even the new images are being, well, not new, but as in newly released images are coming out about that. One of the most recent findings being the rotation rate of Saturn, and some details about the magnetic fields and the rings. Kepler mission, again, is completed. That's an exoplanet mission. Exoplanet is a planet that goes around a star other than our own star, the Sun. And to date, its count is 2,600 exoplanets confirmed, with another 5,000 candidates, but that number could increase because the data archive is still being ploughed through by not only the professionals but also by amateurs, so new ones are being released. LISA Pathfinder, the European Space Agency mission to test gravitational wave technology, finished of course in 2017, and here's some of the data from it. And the requirements here, frequency across here, that's the vibrational vibrations in the spacecraft, and up here is the relative acceleration of the test masses inside, the test masses inside it. LISA only had to do that requirement up there. LISA Pathfinder. For the full LISA mission, which is looking for gravitational waves, they need to get outside that shaded grey box, grey area. The Pathfinder mission, by 2016 April, had done the blue area. In other words, it had far exceeded the Pathfinder requirements, but it hadn't quite met the LISA requirements. However, collecting more data as the mission carried on, by February 2017, the red was what they had achieved, and you can see they can now meet the requirements for LISA, the full LISA mission to look for gravitational waves. Now, for the rest of this talk, current missions. And by that I mean the missions that are actually being launched into space and are still operational as of February, a week or so ago when I finalised this talk. So, look at solar and heliophysics. Those missions are some of the ones that are current. SOHO is the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory, still going strong even though it's launched in 1995. New data is coming out from that all the time, and of course you can always get their pictures. They come out about every half hour, and there's an example of a SOHO picture. They take it in different wave bands, and they colour those according to the wave band, so you know which one's which. And while that's going strong, it's at the L1 position. Now L1 is a gravitational point between the Earth and the Sun. It's about 1% of the distance to the Sun, and it's in a halo orbit around that point, and it can sort of sit there for years. It takes 6 months to go around in the halo orbit. And I haven't got time to mention, but also operating as stereo, which is in heliocentric orbit about 1 astronomical unit from the Sun. And the two of them are going at different speeds. And for a while, they were giving stereoscopic pictures of the Sun, but eventually one passed around there, and they'll catch up again soon. And of course, Solar Dynamics Observatory, amazing pictures coming from that still. And that craft is in Earth orbit looking at the Sun. Another mission that people often overlook is IRIS. And it uses the Doppler shift in the spectrum of the Sun to work out the velocity of the plasma in the Sun. That is in Earth orbit. And it looks very closely at the, particularly at the edge of the Sun. The Japanese mission Hinode, with NASA involvement, launched in 2006, still going strong. And that's an artist's impression of Hinode, looking at the Earth, presumably, even though it's supposed to look at the Sun. And of course, it's in Earth orbit, it's not near the Sun at all. But here's an example of what Hinode sends us back. Here we're looking at the solar limb, and we've got a filament there, and we've got excellent pictures of speckles. And if you can, I don't have time to show any of the movies, but if you can watch these movies for hours and hours, you know, as it studies the motion of the Sun. It also takes good pictures of the sunspots on the Sun. So if you're interested in solar physics and so on, that's a good one to look up, the Hinode mission. Meanwhile, of course, getting a lot of attention is Parker Solar Probe. And I think that mission patch is a bit of an exaggeration. I can actually touch the sun, surely. But the cameras, quite amazing. They're designed to look at the plasma streaming out of the sun, but on the way there, they just said, oh, let's take some test pictures, and this is one of the first ones, and it turns out to be pretty good at astrophotography as well. The orbit, unfortunately, you can get the minute by minute where it is on their website, but unfortunately my web browser won't save that image, so I had to find another one which was a month old. And by now, it's past that point, it's now heading back in towards the sun. It will get gravity assists passing by Venus a number of times till finally, it gets in really close to the sun. Okay. Mercury. We've got, of course, Mariner 10 and Messenger Long's gone, but now we have got Bepi Colombo and Mio, and a third spacecraft there as well. Here we see them now separated, and Mio is the Japanese mission, and Bepi Colombo is the European Space Agency mission. And this was flying in Kourou when they launched it on launch day. And this is a nice little diagram of Mio. MMO is the original name for it, Mercury Magnetospheric Orbiter, but they gave it the Japanese name Mio. I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'll say Mio. But you can see it's got a nice lot of instrumentation, and it has to operate in orbit around Mercury, so the thermal constraints are quite severe. And it's another picture of Mio in orbit around Mercury. But it'll take a fair while to get there, so don't expect it there tomorrow. Now, there's only one spacecraft operating in orbit around Venus at the moment, but there are several, including Parker, that are going to fly by quite close. So Akutsuki, I showed some pictures from that last month here. It was launched in 2010 and operates in various wave bands. And you can see some of them there, and they look at different levels in the clouds. None of them can see right down to the ground, but they can show different levels and the temperatures and the wind flows and so on. So that's quite an amazing mission that's often overlooked by people. Icarus was launched with Akutsuki. It's a solar sail, and it's in heliocentric orbit, and orbits as close as Venus. It made a flyby of Venus in late 2010, early 2011, and from then on, there wasn't much released publicly about it. However, the acronym, by the way, Icarus, you can see there, and passed 80,800 kilometres from Venus. But what it does, it goes into hibernation from time to time. It wasn't intended to, but it somehow switches itself off, and then a few months later, boom, it's back on there again and retransmitting. The last transmission I can find out about was last year, and at the moment it appears to be in hibernation. So I'm putting that in the still operating category, although it might really belong now in the past category. Meanwhile, we've got Chang'e 4 and Utu number 2 on the lunar far side, and they're approaching the lunar dawn. Now you can tell when this is going to happen, because it's almost exactly 180 degrees in longitude. So when the moon looks quarter, what people call half moon, it's really quarter and three-quarter moon, when it's then, you can tell it's either dawn or dusk, sunset for Chang'e. So that's how to tell when to expect it. And it'll be back in contact again on February the 28th for Utu, and Chang'e 4 on March the 1st. It's when they're expecting to make contact with it again, provided it survives the lunar night, which they are expecting it will. Okay, it's already survived one night, and it's now in its second night. So as you look out at the moon, then you can tell when to expect sunrise and sunset for these two craft, because they're about 180 degrees. Now, Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, it's been there for a long, long time, since 2009, and so 10 years now. And of course, it's famous for having found the Apollo and Lunokhod sites. But the moon hoaxers, yeah, we're never convinced them, so. Anyway, it doesn't usually take oblique pictures. It looks straight down normally. And soon after Chang'e 4 landed, they sort of tilted it sideways, said, yeah, look that way. And that's the picture it got. See the two little arrows there? Well, I'll enlarge it up for you. And those arrows point to Chang'e 4. Well, a few days ago, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter flew directly over the two landers. Well, it'd be the first they actually did the flyby, but they just released it a little while ago. And you can see the two arrows pointing to Chang'e 4, which is the larger one, the arrow that points vertically, and the one that points horizontally is the U-2. All right, off to Mars. Now, these missions are currently operating in orbit around Mars or on the surface of Mars. And we've got Mars Odyssey, which you all know got named because of the movie of the same year. And it's doing synoptic surveys of Mars. They release hundreds of these pictures every year on the photojournal website of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and most people just click over them because they don't look very interesting. But in fact, there's quite a lot of information in there. So Mars Odyssey is still operating and doing wonderful work. Mars Express, launched in 2003, stereoscopic photography, and interestingly, the radar, see those antennae there that point out, they are radar transmitters, and they send a signal down, and it passes through dry soil, but reflects off water ice. And they've been able to find, for example, the liquid water under the Martian surface using this. And there's an example of a Mars Express picture superimposed with an artist's impression of the spacecraft itself flying over Mars. So those things are well worth looking up. They're quite beautiful pictures, but because although it takes pictures vertically, because it does it stereoscopically, they can then do rendering 3D pictures and actual stereograms and things like that. So that's a fascinating mission. And that's the mission that landed Beagle 2 on the surface of Mars, which of course failed to operate. Maven, yep. He's not here. I know one of our members went to the launch of Maven, and you can get what the acronym means. And at the moment, it's doing some aerobraking and it's going into a new science orbit. That'll bring it closer to Mars and also will allow it to act as a relay for the Mars 2020 mission, a better relay than it's been doing at the moment for the InSight mission, for example, or the Mars Exploration Rovers or Curiosity. Yeah, right. Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter has been there since 2005 and it's doing fantastic work, including finding Beagle 2 and Opportunity and Phoenix and lots of other things on the surface of Mars. Mars Science Laboratory, launched in 2011, landed in 2012, and doing marvellous work there. And it's got sort of damaged wheels, but it's still climbing Mount Sharp and doing wonderful things, and the panoramas it sends back. It survived the dust storms, of course, because it is powered by a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, which means it doesn't need solar power, unlike Opportunity, which died because of the severe storm. ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter, part of the ExoMars suite of things from the European Space Agency, launched in 2016, and landed in went into orbit. The Schiaparelli spacecraft was supposed to land and operate on the surface, but it crashed. And it then did a series of aerobraking, and this is what this artist impression shows, is skimming through the atmosphere, and that slows it down. You've got to be careful, because if you go too deep, you'll burn up, and or at least wreck the solar panels. And they changed the orbit plane. It was initially in an equatorial orbit, and then they cranked it up, so it's now in a 74-degree orbit, and that gives nice views of the poles and gives global coverage. It's a trace gas orbiter, so it's looking at those trace gases that you see on the right-hand side of the screen there. And for comparison, the Earth is there. Now, here's an interesting thing that TGO can do. It can find Martian ice, and the interesting way how it does it. You've got cosmic rays, which come, of course, through the atmosphere and into the soil. Now, if they hit, say, an atom in the water ice, that emits neutrons. Now, the neutrons can either make it straight up, as in the orange line, whatever colour it looks on the screen there, or the neutron can go into the ice, and like in a nuclear reactor where you use a moderator to slow down the neutrons, it zigs inside the thing and then comes out and goes up back into space. By looking at the difference between the ones that have come directly from there and the ones that have gone through the ice, you can work out how deep the ice is and how much of it there is there. All the way from space. Amazing, isn't it? It's called remote sensing. Insight, well, the heart of Mars, yeah, a bit of an exaggeration, but it's both the seismometer and the probe are now on the surface, but the probe has yet to drill down 5 meters. And I recorded the guy who worked on the probe, on the heat probe, a few weeks ago, and he was on tenterhooks because that weekend it was going to be put down. And unfortunately, that recording's under embargo, and I can't broadcast it until I get written permission from not this guy, but from some other people. Anyway, that's another story. WISE, we're looking now further afield now, and still looking at the solar system. The WISE craft was supposed to find red dwarf stars, and it did, found lots of them. What I was hoping for is that it would find one closer than Proxima Centauri, which, as you know, is the second closest star to the Earth, the Sun being the closest. Well, it didn't. It didn't find any red dwarfs closer than Proxima. So, oh well, I was disappointed, but anyway. To operate an infrared, it needs helium, and it was cooled down, and they ran out of coolant and terminated the mission, and that was the end of the mission. But then they realised, hey, the thing can still operate in infrared, but not the far infrared it needed to do, so it can now look at near-Earth objects, and so it became NEO-WISE, NEO being near-Earth object. So it's now hunting for things that might hit the Earth. Asteroid sample return missions, there are currently 2 underway. One is called Hayabusa, and they made the touchdown a few days ago, and I watched it all live on TV. And then there's this thing called OSIRIS-REx, which is currently at Bennu, and they hopefully can repeat the experiment, get some samples back. Now, Jupiter, we've got 2 missions looking at Jupiter. One's Juno and the other one's Hisaki. Juno is in orbit around Jupiter, and It's got a very low perijove. It's doing particles and fields, although it does have a public access camera on it, which is the one that gets all the attention. But it's the particles and fields that is really the important science here. ISAKI, you've probably never heard of, is an extreme ultraviolet spectroscopy satellite. It's in Earth orbit, launched in 2013, but it looks at Jupiter and a few other planets. And, yep, 4 minutes to go. So, yeah, those artists again, it's not at Jupiter, it's in Earth orbit. But this is the sort of thing it's doing. It's looking at the magnetic fields around Jupiter. Now, I don't know if you realise it, but if you look at Jupiter in the sky, the magnetic field, if you could see it, is bigger than the moon. Our moon looks in the sky. But we just can't see it in our eyes. But ISAKI can see it. And there's something else it's been able to do is look at the Io, the sulfur and stuff coming off Io, because it's a volcanic moon, and goes into orbit around Jupiter and plows down onto follows the magnetic field and hits causes aurora. And there's actually an Io spot in the auroral oval of Jupiter, and that's the stuff coming off Io down there. And ISAKI can watch that. The Hubble Space Telescope and Juno are also sort of investigating this flow of material. Now, the Kuiper Belt and beyond, we've got Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 and New Horizons are still active, and Voyager still going strong and now is in interstellar space. Both of them now are in interstellar space. Both still transmitting, and they reckon it'll keep going to about 2025 or 2030 before they lose contact with it. Gradually have to shut down the instruments as the power levels drop and the distance increases. New Horizons passed Ultima Thule on January the 1st and is now searching for another Kuiper Belt object. And the interesting finding was that although we thought at first they were two spherical objects, and now it looks like they're two pancakes stuck together. All right. TESS, it's got 4 big cameras, each one looking at a different part of the sky, and over 2 years it'll do that sort of coverage. And interestingly, some of that coverage coincides with what is expected from the James Webb Space Telescope. So James Webb will be able to follow up any findings that TESS makes. The special orbit of TESS is that it's in a rather interesting orbit around the Earth, goes out near the moon, and the gravity between the Sun, Earth and the moon keeps it in a particular orbit, which means it doesn't need fuel to stay there. So it can stay there almost indefinitely, and providing all the electronics keep up, it should operate for years and years to come. So here's a picture from TESS, and each speck of that is a star, and it monitors the brightness of those stars, and a slight variation means, there's a planet gone in front, or it could be a big solar flare, and they have to decide. Now, in astrophysics and astronomy, we've got all those things in orbit at the moment, and the Hubble's 1990 still going strong. I reckon it'll end because they'll lose the control gyros, and then it'll start to tumble. But I could be wrong. It could end for something else. We've got Haruka, which was known before launch as Muses B. It's an 8-metre diameter radio telescope launched in 1997, and it does very long baseline interferometry astronomy, and it's still working after all those years. Chandra, X-ray telescope, and some few diagrams over there. And this came out sometime last year. Laugh. Giggle. Yep. Okay. I don't like that program, but anyway, others do. So the trekkies went berserk over that photo. XMM Newton is one you don't hear much of. It's still going from 1999, so it's 20 years later, or almost. No, it's not quite. 19 years later, still going. Well, it's in Earth orbit, and it's got those things. Again, it looks like that. Can you work out why it needs to be so long? Okay, there's a reason for that. Anyway, it doesn't return pretty pictures. You get spectra from it, and that doesn't make the newspapers or magazines, so you don't often see results from that unless you read the scientific literature. But that's a recent picture of a plot from a pulsar. And the background picture, by the way, is just the visible light image. Integral is doing gamma ray astronomy. It's the European Space Agency mission, and it's in Earth orbit. And uses a shadow mask. Don't ask me how that works because I haven't got all day, unless you want to be here till breakfast. And so it doesn't take images of gamma rays, but it locates where they are in the sky. As a result, you don't get a pretty picture. Again, no newspaper or magazine headlines. But this is a plot showing where the gamma ray sources are that it has detected. Spitzer Space Telescope, infrared astronomy, ran out of helium coolant, but can still operate in limited capacity and should run for a little while. But it's going to get, the angle between it and the sun is going to get rather awkward. It's in heliocentric orbit, and it's moving away from the Earth, and it's going to be, it'll lose operability because of the pointing restrictions on it. And new star, as you can see from the name there. And again, why is it long? So there's another picture of new star, and the background is an X-ray image from new star. And this came out just a few days ago from the scientists, and we've got here two merging galaxies, and the new star data is shown in green, and there's a bright source on the upper right there, which is a new finding, as brighter than average neutron star. The other two merging galaxies there have got supermassive black holes in them, and they emit X-rays. Gaia is astrometry, not astronomy, astrometry satellite, which means it measures star positions exactly, precisely. And the spin axis means it scans the sky repeatedly, and over the year it looks at stars. And that's the inside things. Recent publication from it. The blue things are some of the things that only Gaia can do. And as a result of that, when you plot them out, that universe expansion, that dark energy has been expanding the universe faster and faster and faster for longer than we thought. So it's been going on for a long time, this expansion of the universe caused by dark energy. Another thing is, surprise, surprise, it's so accurate, it's able to measure the star motions in the Andromeda galaxy. And as a result of that, it's been able to show that the Andromeda galaxy is not coming for a head-on collision with us, as had previously been thought, but it's going to make a glancing blow. So the circles show where it is now, and then the line shows where it's going to be, and so on. There's another one called the triangulum, which is also doing an interesting motion around it. So we're going to have a collision, yep, but not a head-on smash. So to summarise then, we've had a look just down the first two columns there, and come back next month if you want to find out what's going to happen next. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ed. Thanks, Andrew. That was fantastic. 4 minutes, 20 seconds over time. Well done. We're finally getting trained in the 21st century. That's it for tonight. Thank you so much for all the speakers. Shane, Andrew, Angelo, everyone else. It was a good night tonight. Had fun. We'll see you back here on the 25th of March. If you haven't got our details, or if you're not on any of my mailing list, there's a sheet at the back of the room there. You can just put your name and your email address. We'll just put you on the mailing list. You can find out what's going on with regard to our other events. Don't forget this Saturday, the Moon Forum at Federation Square. You can jump on to our website and follow links to get tickets to go to that. And there's lots of other stuff happening. I can't remember what else I've got to talk about. But anyway, that's it. If you haven't paid your bill, please pay it before you leave. And we'll see you back here next month. It's the 25th of March.